Thank you for tuning into today's lecture hosted by the Center for Global Security Research here at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Asmar Esquedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. Today, we'll be delving into the debate on hypersonic weapons. We're excited to have our speaker, Dr. Carrie Lee from the U.S. Army War College, here to lead that discussion. As many of you already know, there are a small number of countries pursuing hypersonic weapon technology and additional countries conducting research. Many have called hypersonic weapons a game changer, as current missile defense systems are unable to provide an adequate warning of an attack. All of this, of course, has implications for our discourse on deterrence and arms control. So Dr. Lee is here to help us understand the decision-making behind acquiring hypersonic weapons, the associated implications, and she'll also provide recommendations for U.S. policymakers. Just to say a few words about our speaker's background, Dr. Lee is an associate professor at the U.S. Army War College, where she serves as the chair of the Department of National Security and Strategy. She's also the co-director of the USAWC Center on Civil Military Relations. She'll speak to us for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to the audience for a question and answer session. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Carrie Lee to get us started.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I want to extend a big thank you to Brad Roberts for the invitation to present today, as well as Asmaret and Katie for organizing and for hosting this session. My position is up here at the Army War College. Most of my work on hypersonics stemmed from when I was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation from 2015 to 2016, and I was involved in a project looking at nonproliferation alternatives and potential regimes that would prevent the spread of hypersonic weapons technology beyond countries that were indigenously pursuing the weapons and into potentially preventing smaller countries or kind of regional powers from acquiring that. So that's just a little bit of background on where I come at this problem from. I'm now gonna share some slides here, and okay, so I would be remiss if I did not initially say that any thoughts or opinions that I express here today are mine and mine alone. They do not reflect the official position or attitude of U.S. government, Department of Defense, U.S. Army War College, anybody that I have worked for in the past or may work for in the future. These are all mine. So I first want to start with a real brief background. This will be old hat for many of you, but I want to get us started on a kind of similar platform. So what are hypersonic weapons? In general, they are divided into two different categories: hypersonic glide vehicles and hypersonic cruise missiles. What they have in common is that they travel at speeds above Mach 5. So anywhere from Mach 5 to 25. They're also maneuverable, and their trajectory sits along the upper atmosphere. Countries today have various capabilities around hypersonics, but we expect them to fully enter countries' arsenals as operational, this kind of fully developed weapon within the next 5 years or so. The United States actually just announced in July that it had completed a successful test. Russia and China, who are the other two big competitors and investors in this technology, have fielded similar kind of successful tests over the last couple of years. They're not ballistic missiles or simple reentry vehicles. So this is an important distinction. These are their own separate their own separate kind of glide vehicles or potentially scramjet powered cruise missiles. And they have a variety of different warhead options available to them. You have a kinetic warhead option where you actually don't even put a warhead on top of the missile. You use the simple energy that is derived from a missile traveling at that speed to explode something. You can put conventional weapons. You can also put nuclear weapons on them. So why are they different? They're different from ballistic missiles because ballistic missiles have the speed One of the popular misconceptions about hypersonics is that they are the fastest missiles ever. This is not true. Ballistic missiles oftentimes will travel at a very high speed as they go up into orbit and then come down. Not orbit, but up above the atmosphere and then come down on a ballistic trajectory. But they are not maneuverable. And so ballistic missiles have a very predictable trajectory once they are fired. And they don't spend a lot of time inside the Earth's atmosphere. On the other hand, you have cruise missiles, which are maneuverable, but travel at low speeds. So while there are some countries that have supersonic cruise missiles in their arsenal, the United States primarily uses subsonic missiles. And so these are much, much slower, even as they're precise and maneuverable. Hypersonics combine the two. They are both at high speeds above Mach 5 and maneuverable. What that means is that you have target uncertainty until the very last moment and better accuracy, plus the speed means that existing missile defense systems have a much harder time identifying and targeting them to defend against. The flight altitude and maneuverability, again, challenge different types of missile defenses. So it's extremely challenging for current missile defense capabilities. What this means is that we have what many are calling an arms race. And so the warfighting kind of capabilities, or the new capabilities that these new hypersonic missiles and hypersonic weapons offer, have led to heavy investment in this technology, particularly by Russia and China. And so we have a situation where there is a new technology, and a lot of people, particularly in the defense community, are calling for the United States to invest in this in order to keep up with the investments that Russia and China have made. A lot of people have called it a new arms race. Hypersonic weapons are regularly compared to other types of presumed revolutionary technologies, like nuclear weapons in the past and AI, artificial intelligence today. The literature is a little bit split on whether we should be acquiring these weapons, however. The more bullish actors speak to the technical benefits of the weapons for achieving operational goals, particularly in the East China Sea and South China Sea. But recent kind of more academic scholarship has been decidedly less sanguine about this, and have kind of called for a reconsideration based on concerns about strategic stability and allied assurance, and as well as kind of inadvertent escalation. So what I'm going to argue today is that we've jumped ahead of the game, and what many of proponents and deterrents of hypersonic technology, particularly in the acquisition realm, have missed is a critical step actually in the design of policy solutions, which is that we have yet to determine what exactly the problem is that hypersonic weapons pose to strategic stability. So should the United States be acquiring and investing in hypersonic weapons capabilities and be investing in hypersonic missiles? You can't know that until you understand what the costs are, both in terms of warfighting and strategic costs, as well as the potential benefits that you're going to gain from any new technology acquisition, both from a warfighting and a strategic perspective. So what I'm going to walk through today is a general outline of, should the US invest in hypersonic technology? This is kind of the big overarching question. What should we be using and investing in part, because anytime you choose to invest in a new technology, you're necessarily making decisions about what you're not going to invest in. Budgets, in fact, we live in a resource, a zero-sum kind of resource world, and so budgets reflect priorities. And in a world of finite resources, dedicating funding to a new weapon system necessarily means depriving other initiatives of monies and resourcing. It doesn't mean to say that we should never invest in new technology, right? But you need to make sure that the new technology that we invest in, that we field, and that we acquire sufficiently increases a state's warfighting or strategic position compared to the relative costs. Otherwise, we should be looking somewhere else to invest. So from a warfighting perspective, technology can at times increase a state's warfighting potential and therefore provide advantages on the battlefield that make investing in such technologies necessary for success in war. They may decrease the costs associated with pursuing particular strategies. They may open up new areas of attack. They might expand the range of options that a decision maker has when deciding to prosecute a war. And so technology may then alter the lists of potential targets. They may enable a state to hold particular sites at risk that they hadn't before. They might be able to accomplish something more effectively, more efficiently with lower loss of life. And all of these are what we might consider warfighting advantages to new technology. These also come with costs, though, most particularly, as I mentioned before, in the term of budget, as we live in kind of a resource finite world. But costs can also mean in terms of manpower and training. If you think about any type of new technology, this then requires retrofitting some. If you think of modernization technology, when you're modernizing something, you need to necessarily retrofit, or you're replacing something entirely. That requires significant investment as well as training in terms of manpower. Maybe you need a whole new category of people. As we're dealing with a new domain in space, we have a space force now. That requires an awful lot of investment in terms of time and manpower trying to stand something up. So there are costs associated and kind of finite costs associated with improving warfighting effects as well. From a strategic perspective, you can have a lot of different new technology can have quite a few strategic effects as well. They can affect a state's ability to deter or coerce, essentially. So from a deterrent standpoint, new technology can make a threat more credible and make good on a state's willingness to respond or retaliate to a particular threat or action. We saw this with the attempts in the latest nuclear posture review calling for the introduction of low-yield nuclear weapons to try and counter the Russian kind of doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. So new technologies or different types of technologies can make threats more credible, make a state's willingness to respond actually seem like a state actually would respond in that way. It might also alter the balance of power. So new technologies like the introduction of nuclear weapons significantly alters a balance of power when it comes to destructive potential and a state's ability to wage and win a war. And so that necessarily changes negotiations and international relations and the strategic environment. However, new technologies can also come with significant strategic costs. When you look at the introduction of any kind of new technology, you may find that it actually destabilizes the international system by creating a first strike advantage, for example. And so you end up in a Mexican standoff type of situation where the first person to pull the trigger is the one who is necessarily going to reap the most benefits, and waiting to be struck first creates huge disadvantages because you wouldn't be able to retaliate. You also can see significant costs through through signaling. And so new technology can significantly affect a state's ability to signal its intentions. Especially if you're thinking about dual use technology, it can obscure a state's ability to signal its intentions. And so a buildup and take you from what Jervis would call a deterrence model, where each state is fairly comfortable in its second strike capabilities, it's fairly comfortable in the technology that its adversary has, into a kind of spiral model where you introduce security dilemmas and therefore undermine your ability to signal what you want to do. And I will get to this with the hypersonic case. I think this is a really important part of why people are worried about hypersonic weapons technology. Finally, new technologies can have significant strategic effects through signaling about resolve. So not just signaling about intentions, but signaling about one's resolve. In particular, if you have technology that gets introduced that automates decisions away from humans, this is necessarily a signal of one's resolve. Schelling goes into great detail on this in his work, thinking about, to use a popular cultural reference, the doomsday machine. If you automate something away, then it absolutely says to your adversary, I don't necessarily have control over this. And so if you do this, then you will absolutely 100%, I know that you will face the following effects, rather than leaving it up to a human who might hesitate to respond. And so new technologies can either increase signals for resolve or decrease them, depending on what you're talking about. So for hypersonic weapons, let's talk about the warfighting effects of hypersonic weapons first. The nature of these missiles, in particular, the biggest warfighting advantage of this is that they are able to quickly damage or evade air defenses. And so, or missile defense systems, I should say. This is really good for a fast-acting, quick operational strategy like in a fait accompli situation. This is an area where, missile defenses are not, they're not perfect. And so quantity can be a quality all on its own, but it requires a large buildup. It requires an awful lot of missiles in order to do so. Hypersonic weapons, because they're fast, they're undetectable, they're not undetectable, but they're difficult to respond to, and they're relatively precise. Are able to evade air defenses and achieve objectives in a way that a simple supersonic or subsonic missile would not be able to. What that means is that states are able to move much more quickly towards their objectives. It also introduces decapitation as a viable strategy. So because of their speed, because of their precision, what this means is that it holds command centers at much more risk than you would otherwise expect. Where you might have a much longer kind of warning period of an incoming missile or an incoming threat. Costs associated with hypersonic weapons, I would argue, are primarily financial. In particular, the estimated costs of acquiring hypersonic missiles has ballooned significantly over the last several years. And so now we're looking at an estimated about $100 million per missile, which is pretty significant, especially when you compare to a Tomahawk missile that costs the United States about $1 million per missile. So you can get 100 Tomahawks or one hypersonic, and that creates some important trade-offs and considerations when we're thinking about when these might be used. The strategic effects. It's entirely possible that hypersonic weapons for the United States might increase the credibility of deterrent threats. The ability to strike quickly with relatively low cost associated with the deployment of a weapon or to evade some kind of air defense system certainly increases the credibility of a state's threat that they might make towards an adversary. And so if we think that credibility is the combination of capability and will, then hypersonic weapons are certainly increasing that capability and also increasing that will function, because the costs associated with it in terms of lives lost, in terms of mobilization required, et cetera, are significantly lower. However, you might see some problematic effects on the strategic side. And this is where I think we need to think very carefully about what we're introducing when the United States thinks about acquiring hypersonic weapons. In particular, it may decrease the United States' ability to assure allies in some somewhat counterintuitive ways. This is hypersonic weapons. If you're thinking about from a global standpoint, and I'm not talking about the kind of the regional, more regional intermediate level, but from a global standpoint, if the United States can strike anywhere on the globe using conventional prompt global strike, which is the framework that the United States has been thinking about, historically had been thinking about hypersonic weapons, this necessarily then reduces the need to be based in allied countries. It reduces the need to be forward postured because we have the ability to strike from long range. And so what does that do to a relationship with an ally who previously gained a lot of assurance from having US weapons, US troops, US investment inside that country? That's something really to think about. I also argue that hypersonic weapons significantly increase your problem with signaling your intentions. And this is for two reasons, both of which James Acton goes into in fairly great detail in his 2013 monograph, Silver Bullet. But this has to do with kind of warhead ambiguity and target ambiguity. So because hypersonic weapons, and there's no regime set up to determine whether hypersonic weapons should carry only conventional weapons or only nuclear weapons, because it's dual use, you have a warhead ambiguity problem, which means that once a person identifies, or a system identifies, that a hypersonic missile is on its way, it's impossible to tell whether it's carrying a conventional or nuclear payload. And so states then have to assume the worst, because if you don't know, then optimism is not your friend. So warhead ambiguity really can cause some significant problems if you see a launch and you have to assume that there's a nuclear payload, and there's a nuclear payload on that missile. There are ways to get around that, but so far we've seen very few, if any, discussions about how to mitigate those problems. The second issue that you find is with target ambiguity, and this has to do with the maneuverability of the missiles. So if you don't, these missiles are moving so fast that even small changes in direction can result in really different targets. And so if a state doesn't understand or doesn't know who is firing what and where something is supposed to land, again, they have to assume the worst, that we might be targeting nuclear C2 or other kind of really vital infrastructure pieces, because again, they just don't know. So this kind of ambiguity from both kind of what warhead is on the missile as well as what the target is going to be really increases your problems with being able to signal your intentions. I'm acquiring hypersonic weapons, the United States or some other state, I'm acquiring hypersonic weapons, but I can't guarantee that I'm not going to strike at you in the event of a launch, or I can't guarantee that there's not going to be a nuclear payload on there when I do launch it, if I want to, say, try to decapitate a terrorist organization. So, or go after terrorist leaders. It's really difficult to signal intentions when your adversary doesn't know or can't know with any certainty where your missile is going and what's on it. The third kind of strategic problem that hypersonic weapons introduce has to do with strategic stability. And again, this has to do with their ability to enable these fait accompli scenarios. Fait accompli scenarios are the definition of first strike advantage. And so while this is great from a warfighting perspective, you're able to get the element of surprise, you're able to move quickly and take territory quickly, your adversary also knows that as well. And so the introduction of hypersonic weapons into one's arsenal and into one's a state's kind of potential weapons to be used then creates your adversary then realizes that you could take territory very quickly. And so that again takes you from a deterrence model where you know that you have a second strike capability, or you know that you're able to effectively respond to aggression, into much more of a spiral model and security dilemma model, where first strikes and first mover are kind of significant first mover advantages, which undermines this kind of fundamental strategic stability. So, to sum up, hypersonic weapons from a warfighting and operational perspective are much more useful to revisionist states who are seeking to accomplish these fait accompli scenarios. This is the primary advantage of hypersonic weapons, is to allow states to move quickly and efficiently in order to take territory and evade the kind of air defenses that would prevent a fast assault. However, they also introduce significant uncertainty into the international system due to their unpredictability and speed. They limit a state's ability to signal its intentions. They limit a state's ability to give allied assurance, and they end up decreasing strategic stability, particularly in a regional context, when you're thinking about these fait accompli type scenarios. So the conclusion that I come to in the paper that was published in the Texas National Security Review is that while it makes all the sense in the world for Russia and China to be pursuing these weapons because US missile defense capabilities are much more sophisticated than those of the Chinese and the Russians, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the United States to be pursuing these weapons. Number one, because it doesn't have revisionist aims across the globe. And so having a slower response is not necessarily a deal breaker in the international community or in a response to Russian or Chinese aggression. But it also helps to signal US intentions about territorial grabs and reestablish and reassert that the United States is fundamentally a status quo power interested in stability and sort of mutual deterrence. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and happily take some questions.